Good afternoon. We have Sigurt Vitols here to my left. And Mr. Vitols works for the Scientific Center Berlin for Social Research and European Trade Union Institute. And then we also have Rainald Thannisch to my on the other side, who works for the German trade union. And we are going to talk about, well, this new directive now. Of course, it comes from the European level, from the European Union, but of course, it will have an enormous impact on people here in Germany, but also across Europe. Now, I don't want to waste a lot of time. We only have 45 minutes anyway. So I hope you will find this interesting. I hope you won't get bored. I hope this will be a relevant discussion to you. And if you have any questions online as well, you can pipe them into the chat field. And of course, we won't be gone after this session anyway, so you can always contact us afterwards as well. Well, first of all, CSRD, like I said, that's a directive. In Germany, we call it Nachhaltigkeitsberichterstattung, but on a European level, it's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Now, who had this idea to call it that? Obviously, it was jurists, legal experts in Brussels, I assume, but the basic idea here is to revise the sustainability reporting across Europe. And I can already tell you, we're talking about 15,000 companies in Germany that would be affected and 50,000 across Europe that would be covered by this directive. And the main question, of course, is, well, why is there this directive? Why did some people in Brussels say, well, let's just change the reporting system? The reason for that is that sustainability is a topic that gains more and more relevance, not only in a private context for many of us, but also when you look at the newspapers, for example, you will see the headlines, you will notice that the topic is there and it won't go away. Of course, it is not only about the climate, but also about social aspects. Human rights are sometimes really completely ignored and violated. We had several sessions on this morning, in particular the main panel session this morning, where it became clear just how important and topical this whole issue is. The basis of the entire reporting system that we are going to talk about is ESG. ESG is, so to speak, the underlying concept that the whole reporting system rests upon. Actually, it's 3 pillars that the topic of sustainability is based on. It's environmental, social, and governance. And sorry for this technical talk, but when we talk about a directive, we have to be a bit technical sometimes. Environmental, social, and governance. And of course, for each of these 3 pillars, we have something different. When we look at this slide, for example, then you can see there are topics in each pillar that play a great role for us as workers' representatives. For example, equal opportunities, the freedom of assembly, and so on. And that's why it's important to us as well to participate, to play a role here, because we don't want the company to report, well, just whatever it wants, but in the report, we also want to be taken into consideration. We want to be on board. So, of course, the ESG project is always a bit problematic, but we try to make our contribution, to play our part, and to participate in the discussions on the things that should be reported in the future. I wouldn't call this lobby work, but at the end of the day, it is just that. It is like lobby work. That's what we are doing. Now, in order to understand why this reporting is so important and so relevant, we have to understand where we come from. I mean, in the past, we used to have a reporting obligation, but that only applied to about 500 companies in Germany, and it was kind of a show run because the reporting never led to any real consequences. And even when you didn't comply with your reporting obligation, the sentences you got were only marginal. But this will change drastically with the new directive because we now have the reporting obligation and there is a final auditor who will really verify the report, which means we are now in a totally different situation on a totally different level. And the colleagues who work in the supervisory boards, they really have to deal with these reports, with the topics that they have to talk about in the report. And I know there are a lot of supervisory boards in many companies that really actively play this part, whereas others are still, well, taking their first steps, and we have to encourage them to make progress. So the obligation to report consists of two parts. First of all, there's the guideline, the directive that I talked about, and it's already in action. It was passed in November 2022, so in November last year, which means it is legally binding. It has been passed and published. And this directive, as is always the case with directives, has to be translated into German law. And that's the process that is currently going on. The German legislator has 18 months to do that, which means the process has to be completed by June next year. That's why there are discussions and negotiations going on currently in the background in order to see how to translate all of this into German law. So currently they are developing a draft law for that, and we hope that it will be, well, available this month. We hope the Federal Ministry of Justice will be able to make that possible, so we can have a look at the draft law this month. And then there's a second part that also plays a role for the directive, and that's the standards, because the directive only gives you a list of topics, things that you have to talk about in the report. So like a list of topics, but then there's also the standards, and the standards make it clear how to really report about these different topics technically. So if you put these two concepts together, the directive and the standards, then you have the overall obligation to report. First of all, there's the directive, and then there's the standards. Now, the standards are not just based on the directive, but they are separate legal acts. So when you go through such a procedure, in the end, you will be bound by law to apply the standards as well. This won't be translated into national law. I mean, linguistically, it will be translated into languages of the member states. But apart from that, the standards will be the same for all countries. And again, it's not surprising. And when I say, it doesn't come as a surprise when I say these standards are, well, based on the lobby work as well. And, well, it would be interesting to hear from a European and from a German perspective what's currently going on, what the negotiations and discussions currently look like in this field. Now, the core piece of the entire obligation to report is what is called the dual materiality. Sorry for this technical term, but that's the core piece. That's what it's all about, the so-called dual materiality. And I used climate change as one example here to illustrate what this means. I mean, in the past, in the old reporting systems, companies normally had a look at the impact that the climate has on the company. That's the so-called financial materiality. They had a look at the financial impact the climate has on the company's business activities. But what would also be interesting to know is part of the company's responsibility, in particular if it's supposed to be climate neutral, if you think about the Green Deal in Europe, well, then it's also interesting to see what kind of footprint the company leaves behind. And that's the other perspective. In order to really paint the full picture. So you have both perspectives, outside in and inside out, as I call them. And that's the so-called dual materiality. We used to have a single or simple materiality. Now we have these two perspectives, this dual materiality that's very good, but it also means you have to, well, provide way more details in your report, as we will see a bit later. I also brought something here. I hope you can read this very well. The headline is, who has to report? Like I said, so far, only 500 German companies had to report. Now it's about 15,000 in Germany and 50,000 in Europe. Now, whether or not a company has to submit such a report depends on its legal status. All larger capital corporations, larger companies of public interests, capital market-oriented small and medium-sized enterprises, you can see that here. So more and more companies will be obliged to provide or submit such a report. But this doesn't apply to all companies from the very first year. No, the lobbyists made sure that it's a step-by-step approach. So those companies who already have to report with the old system, they will also have to report, well, under the new system. That's the 500 companies in Germany that I talked about. And they will have to submit such a report in 2024, which means next year. I think these companies still have some catching up to do. I have the impression that not all of them have fully understood what, well, is waiting for them. So it is expected that the first companies will only submit their reports in 2025. So 2024 is the first year that has to be reported, and the report will be submitted in 2025 for the year 2024. And again, that's something new. In the company's situation report, or the company's report on the state of affairs, there will also be a reference to this report, to the content of this report. And work councils also have to be on board when these reports are made. And we will hear a bit more about that in a minute. But first of all, what I wanted to show you here on this slide is that depending on their legal status, the companies will have to join the new system step by step. And the kickoff, or the most important year, will be 2025, when the first reports for 2024 will be submitted, and in particular the year 2026, because that's when the lion's share, the majority of companies, will submit their reports for 2025, which means companies don't have a lot of time. They have to collect data. They have to look at key performance indicators, and some of these key performance indicators don't even exist yet. Sometimes we don't even have them. So that's a lot of administrative work waiting for these companies. And then one more slide, very briefly, because, or one or two slides actually, about the standards as well, because that's the second part of the whole system that I mentioned. And that is, so to speak, well, the main problem that people are talking about. I mean, the directive has been passed, it is binding, but there are still negotiations around these standards. And there's three pieces of, or three sets of standards. First of all, there are the sector independent standards. Here we have the first draft, and I think we will be able to discuss these standards today. But the other two segments are still work in progress, the sector-specific standards and the company-specific standards. Now, these three types of standards will be relevant for all companies in the future. Of course, depending on the precise, on the way in which the company is precisely organized, but there will be lots of key performance indicators, lots of content, lots of information that have to be that will have to be reported. And I just mentioned ESG, environmental, social, and governance. Environment, social matters, and governance. This is mentioned here as well. And you know, in the beginning, I showed you this table as an overview, and you will find these topics here as well for environment, social, and governance. We are really glad and pleased to see that the social aspects are part of the whole system, and we will hear more about that later on. But obviously, there are negotiations going on where some people try to reduce the social aspects that should be mentioned in the report. I mean, these are various standards. We always call it a standard, but actually it's a set of lots and lots of standards that have to be applied. Now the question is, here we have the standards, the topics that are, we also have the topics that are part of the directive, but how do we get from there to the individual topics that we really want to report on? And that's why there are materiality analysis going on in the companies. And of course, it's not up to the company. It's not just the company's decision which topics it will report on, but there's a whole process going on, a materiality analysis, as it is called. And during this analysis process, they try to really have a look at all the topics that are relevant to the company. And one aspect here is the stakeholders. We are stakeholders, and stakeholders are explicitly mentioned in the directive. So this is the first time we really leave an obvious footprint in the reporting. This is a way in which we can participate in the reporting. Of course, quite a lot of these topics can also be thrown out in the end before they will be part of the report. We'll see what happens in the future. Here, once again, the step-by-step introduction for the different types of company, depending on their legal status. And now it's Sigurt's turn. And once again, thank you very much. Rainald, will you start? Yes, Oliver, thank you very much. And welcome also from my side. My name is Reinhard Thannisch. I used to work for the German Trade Unions Association for 19 years, and I accompanied the development of this dossier. I really was part of the process from the very first discussions. In August this year, I started to work as a participation expert for Verdi, the Trade Union Association. But, you know, this project here, this system was discussed while I was still working for the DGB, the German Trade Union Association. Now, I would like to say a few words about the sustainability reporting standards in Germany and across Europe, and a few words about the directive. The directive was a tremendous step forward, as Oliver has already said. Quantitatively, this is a real milestone because so many more companies are now part of it. For example, GmbHs, in other words, limited liability companies with more than 1,000 employees, they are part of the system, which wasn't really the case in the past, but now GmbHs, limited liability companies with more than 1,000 employees, are part of it. Banks or insurance companies were not part of it in the past, but they are part of the new system. So that's the quantitative process of progress, because we have way more participants in the system now, but also qualitatively. We think about collective agreements, the share of employees covered by a collective agreement, the existence or absence of a works council, all of that is part of the system now. One problem is that the dual materiality system sometimes also excludes certain core topics that we would like to be included. But anyway, it's good to see the qualitative and quantitative improvement. Like I said, one aspect is how many or what share of the employees is covered by a collective agreement, and is there a works council? And we get also, with all of this, we get evidence on how far spread co-determination and participation really is, and to what extent employees are represented in the supervisory board. So we get more facts, more information on that in order to see to what extent the participation and co-determination of employees is really spread across Europe. We will also learn about the remuneration of members of the board. Again, that also has to be part of the report. And that is also an important tool, in particular for workers' representatives in dealing with the supervisory board. So yes, this EU directive was a tremendous step forward, a genuine success. And in particular, as far as the social progress is concerned here, the social area, we owe this success to the Social Democrats and the Green and Left Party in the European Parliament. They really attached great importance to the social aspects of this directive. And in the end, there was a majority for this directive in the European Parliament, which is very good, of course. But of course, this, as has been said already, this has to be translated into German law now. And in a way, we are really waiting for the draft law coming from the Federal Ministry of Justice. It was announced for this summer, but summer is over now, so we are really waiting for it to be published any time. And this will be interesting. It will be interesting to see that draft law for Germany. But there will be another progress operatively, because the Works Council will be integrated even more than in the past. Now, there's something that I'd like to read out. That's what the European Directive says. Article 29A, the company management informs the workers' representatives in an appropriate manner and discusses with them the information and the methods to collect information on sustainability. And that's exactly what employees on a European level need, because you do not always have works councils. In Germany, typically you have the works councils, but sometimes you don't have official works councils as bodies that represent the employees. So I assume that group works councils, European works councils, all of them would have to be taken on board. It will be interesting to see how the Federal German Ministry of Justice will handle this, but it's very obvious that works councils have to be taken on board. And another sentence, the position of the employees will be shared with the supervisory and administrative institutions. That's also interesting. So as employees, as employees representatives and works councils, we have the chance to, well, share our point of view, our perspective as well. And if that doesn't happen properly, then we can criticize that, we can interact with each other. That, again, is a very interesting approach, and I'm convinced that the reports will have a better quality. The fact that employees' representatives and works councils are on board, the reports will have a better quality because they are the ones who have the necessary expertise on social matters. And of course, they are also in close contact with their colleagues in other locations in other countries, because this is a big European network. Just think of the European Works Councils. So I'm really convinced that our colleagues will be able to make a significant contribution to the quality of the reports, and they will be able to really put those topics that they, as works councils, find important on the agenda. All of that will become part of the reporting, so the works councils and employees' representatives can really make sure that certain important aspects will actually be part of the final report. Yes, and this was really a big highlight, one of the big successes in European policies, when this was introduced, this directive. That was really the climax, the highlight. And after that, of course, the lobbying work of the employers started with the standards, when the standards were discussed. The first drafts of the standards were pretty good. Then the next drafts were not that good anymore. Then the EU Commission presented something that was even worse. We can live with the standards the way they are now, but we could really see tough lobbying work of, the associations of employers, and they were obviously terribly afraid of any kind of progress. And that's why the standards were watered down a bit. And so we had this beautiful success when this directive was passed in the European Parliament. But after that, it got harder and harder with the standards. And one thing that I would like to say as well, I don't like a word like cheap trick, but quite frankly, we now have a directive that is supposed to be used by many, many additional companies that were not covered by the old reporting systems. And now they try to take that away again. They try to undo that. But how? The directive has been passed, but it's based on the balancing and accounting directive. Our colleague, Mr. Fischer, talked about this morning, I think. I only participated online. But anyway, the financing directive says there are 3 criteria: the number of employers, the net turnover, and the overall account balance, or the annual balance, the annual accounts. And now, of course, another factor that plays a role here is the inflation. There's no way to ignore it. Just look into your purse. We have an inflation, but privately, this is my private point of view, I think it's problematic. Just a few months after the directive was published, they already start to narrow down the scope of application, because for these 3 criteria that I just listed, it's enough to have 2. If the number of employees, the net income, and the balance total. And if you just meet 2 of these 3 criteria, you're part of the system. But for each of them, or at least for 2 of them, for the net revenue and the balance total, the threshold was increased. So you need a higher income, so to speak, or a better annual balance in order to really be covered by the system. And there are reports in the newspaper on attempts to further reduce the number of companies that would be covered by this. Maybe by introducing an additional group of companies between small enterprises and medium-sized enterprises. So maybe this third aspect that I talked about, which is the number of employees, maybe there too, they will increase the threshold that you have to surpass to be even covered by the directive. So again, that would be an attempt to further reduce the scope of application for this initiative. There would be less and less companies that would be covered by this directive. Hello, thank you, Oliver and Rainald, for this for these reports. My name is Sigurt Vitols. I work for the Scientific Academy on Social Research in Berlin, and I've worked on this topic of sustainability reporting standards for 3 years now. sustainability reporting standards. So maybe from now on, I will only say standards to keep it short, but it means sustainability reporting standards. I've cooperated with Rainald for 19 years, really, since the very first year, from the very first year on. I worked as an advisor for the European Trade Union Association, and I was nominated to represent the trade unions' interests in this European work in order to develop these standards. I've been active on the European level for quite a long time, and I also know about the other fights we had to fight related to other directives. Anyway, to get back to the initial question, CSRD, greenwashing or game changer? I think that depends. There are some prerequisites, some building blocks that play a role here. One prerequisite is now there. The CSRD is there. It has been passed, and that was a great achievement. The cooperation between NGOs and trade unions was really excellent. There were quite a lot of investors as well who just wanted more information on companies. So we cooperated also very well with the progressive parties in the European Parliament. It was really a very good kind of consultation and cooperation. So quite a lot of things worked very well in the context of the CSRD. The two previous speakers already said what the most important parts of the directive are. First of all, the dual materiality. So the information must not only be relevant to investors, but also to employees and their representatives and NGOs. And that is something that we have now with the CSRD. Then the reports have to be verified. They have to be double-checked. PricewaterhouseCoopers, for example, they say they need 100,000 new employees just in order to audit these reports. So that's a lot of work for these big four companies. They don't really know where to recruit experts that quickly, but that's something they will have to do. A lot of auditing work. There has to be a supervision and auditing procedure to make sure that the reports published by the companies are really accurate and true. Quite a lot of company will be affected. It's currently 50,000 across Europe, and if the standards are watered down a bit, then maybe less companies will be affected. But still, it's a very large number of companies that will be bound by this new directive. And there's a clear list of things that the companies have to report on. For example, as far as social aspects are concerned, there are quite a lot of things from social rights and from the Human Rights Convention. All the tools are part of it, due diligence as well. We also have 6 environmental goals that the companies have to report on. So yes, we have a very good directive here. So when you read the sustainability reports, you always know there's always a lot of greenwashing with beautiful photos, and companies talk about the beautiful projects they carry out in developing countries, but a lot of greenwashing currently in the old system. Not all companies do it that way, but quite a lot of them do it or have done it so far. So the question is, will we have relevant reports in the future? Reports that are relevant to employees and to NGOs? That's one prerequisite that has to be met. I mean, we have the CSRD now. Another prerequisite, as Rainald just said, is to put it into practice, because the CSRD doesn't say that in Germany you have to consult the Works or cooperate with the Works Council or with the European Works Council. So it's the task of the trade unions to make sure that all of this is translated properly into German law and then implemented in such a way that employees' representatives will become part of the reporting process. And then the materiality assessment, the materiality analysis, you already commented on that and explained that quite a bit. Now, the second requirement is the CSRD does talk about a lot of fields, but it doesn't really state precisely what the companies have to report. For example, fair pay. That's what the CSRD says. Companies have to report on fair pay. But what is fair pay, fair wages? And what do companies have to say about that? Do they have to say how many of their employees receive a decent pay? Or how many of them don't receive a fair pay? It's not quite clear yet what the companies have to say about fair pay. And that's what will be defined by the standards. So the standards will define very clearly what kinds of information the companies have to provide. What do the companies have to say in the report? For example, when they talk about the employees, will they have to say precisely how many employees they have and in which countries and which locations? All of that will be defined by the standards. We submitted our proposal in November. It was developed by EFROG. I don't know how many of you have heard of EFROG before. It's kind of a secret world, when these standards are defined and how the whole process works. It's all very technical, in fact. And it's, like I said, it's a secret world, but it's also a very small world. It's the big four, first and foremost, but now trade unions and NGOs will also be on board. So we now have a multi-stakeholder approach, a more open process to define the standards. So the whole discussion now takes place more or less in public. Anyway, we cooperated very well. I was the only TU representative in this institution. Overall, there were more than 20 people, some representatives of NGOs and also some progressive investors. And I think this whole process yielded good results. It's a document that's actually over 400 pages long, but anyway, it's not so easy to read, that document, but in a way it includes everything, all the things that the companies will have to report. We submitted this document to the Commission in November. But of course, the other side, the employers' associations, they did their lobby work against that. Ursula von der Leyen wants to become, the chairwoman of the Commission again. For that, she needs the support of her party, the CDU, the Conservative Party. As a result, everything was reduced. The reporting obligations were reduced by 25%. And of course, that also has an impact on our recommendations. Many of the rules, many of the standards were mandatory, things that you have to report. And now they have become, part of the materiality analysis, which means the company can decide and has to decide if a piece of information is relevant and important. And if the company decides that it's not important, for example, we don't have any slave labor in our supply chain, or we don't have any forced labor in our supply chain. So the company can make that decision and then say, well, that's why the whole thing is not important. And then they don't have to disclose that piece of information anymore. So that's the next field where the employers' representatives have to take action to make sure that these important topics cannot just be swept under the carpet, but that the management, the board of the company really mentions these topics in the report as well. It has to be mandatory. They have to be obliged to say what their policies are, what kinds of measures they take with regard to all of these important topics. Yes, and and then there are the industrial sector standards as well, further standards, but that's another task for EFROG. And then we have regulations for non-EU companies. That's also very important. The fight is continuing. And, it's still a discussion, and these are still negotiations that are currently underway. Okay, before we can take questions from the audience, maybe just one thing I would like to add. You just mentioned the auditing companies. And the interesting thing is, what they sometimes say is you can shake the tree, but nobody will fall down from the tree. In other words, the whole market is empty. They really have a hard time to recruit new experts for the auditing companies. Are there any questions? Here in this room, or maybe remotely from our digital viewers? Oh, there's one question over there at the back. Yes, I would like to know. I mean, maybe I just didn't notice it. Maybe I just didn't hear it. But to what extent are there any sanctions and sentences? How sharp is this sword really? That's one question. And the second question is, how much of German conflict partnership is part of that? Also, as an institutional innovation for European neighboring countries, And the third question, again, that's about the sanctions. To what extent do you think that externalization processes might play a role? I mean, we talked about that with value creation chains in that context as well. And you also mentioned it. You said that the whole supply and value creation chain has to be free from slave labor or child labor, forced labor, and that the company has to document that. But obviously, there's no level playing field here because obviously, time and again, companies are able to hide these things. Well, first of all, the sanctions. Yes, this is clearly defined. The supervisory board, or rather, the report will be examined and verified by the auditors. Now, we've been in contact with some auditing companies. They're not just any auditing companies, but really high-ranking players. And there's also a German standard institution that defines the standards here in Germany, and I'm part of that institution. And of course, when you have a company with investors and the auditing company, the external auditing leads to a limited certificate, then this means you will be downgraded, your credit rating will decrease. Maybe you won't even get a loan from a bank anymore because banks also have to submit a report on their business activities. So as it is mandatory to have your certificate audited, this already is, in a way threatening. It really forces you to do the right thing because otherwise, if you don't receive a certificate or confirmation from the external auditors, then this will have a massive negative impact on the reputation of your company. And we are already hearing from companies that say they're really afraid that if they don't receive a positive auditing certificate in the end, they're really afraid of that, and they're really willing to cooperate with employees' representatives. They're really trying to do all they can to make sure they will get an unlimited confirmation and certificate in the end. Yes, one important question is the sanctions. One colleague within the DGB, the German Trade Union Association, had a look at one of the sustainability standards, and he saw that there was a mistake in the CO2 emissions numbers. So the report said the CO2 emissions had dropped, but that was wrong. In fact, it had increased. Now, what do you do in such a case? Currently, there's nothing you can do about it. So the question is really, how do you implement that? What are the sanctions if a company provides false information? And there will also be, an authority that is supposed to supervise the auditors. That should be part of the implementation. There also should be a complaint mechanism where works councils can complain and where they can say, we were not part of the reporting process, or the information provided by our company is false. And of course, when that happens, there have to be very tough sanctions. Yes, and of course, the supervisory board is liable. The supervisory board has the obligation not only to supervise the accounting, but also the sustainability reports. So the supervisory boards are liable. That's the situation. And that also means that the whole system will work in a totally different way. The cases that you have just described, where there might be a difference between an accounting report and then the same number in the sustainability report, this discrepancy won't really happen anymore in the future. Yes, exactly. It has to be tested by the supervisory board. Okay, one more question right here and one question over there. Alex Knebel, that's my name. I work for the German timber industry, also part of the Employers Association. Okay, first of all, thank you very much for the interesting presentations. In our company, we also have a climate protection initiative. I think we are amongst the pioneers in that field in our industry. But I would like to ask, a provocative question. You talked about, well, things that, things that large companies, stock-noted companies might do wrong. So let me put it like this. Don't you also see a risk there? Don't you see that? I mean, of course, reporting obligations have increased drastically over the past few years. There's no doubt about that. Don't you think that this might also be a problem for the competitiveness of companies? Because you should also be interested in, well, being part of competitive companies. Or don't you see any risk there at all? And another question, as far as the social matters, aren't these things are concerned, aren't these things that you know anyway about these companies? Okay, we'll just take a few questions and then answer them afterwards. I work for the German metal trade union. How do auditors really verify everything? Are they really able to do a plausibility test? Are they able to really double check everything? Or will they just say, okay, you checked the right boxes, so everything must be fine? How do auditors really assess whether or not the report is correct? Okay, we don't have a lot of time left. And of course, I get your point. Now, of course, we are talking about European standards here. There's a European law on supply chains. So with this new law, we will also have European standards and we will have a level playing field. So this point that Germany stands alone and has a competitive disadvantage doesn't play any role anymore, at least not in the context of the sustainability reporting system. And I have to say that the companies, they have this information. But of course, it's also interesting to use this information for the internal processes of the company. And it's also interesting to use these factors, well, for our sustainability discussion. I mean, for a long time, the sustainability discussion has been dominated by very important green topics, but I think the social matters that are also very important could also be part of it now. And that's the one good thing about the new directive. Well, yes, in a way, we've heard this point quite a lot of times. We have some very active, well, representatives of well, employers associations as well. In the discussion, we did cost-benefit analysis, and like Rainald said, the standards were weakened and watered down anyway. There are specific standards for the SMEs, and they are not as demanding. They don't ask as much information as the standards want from the larger companies. So I think we have really tried to address this problem that you just mentioned. Now, as far as the social standards are concerned, that's where I did most of my work. And here we asked ourselves, what would a good each HR department know about the employees, or what should it know? And we also asked ourselves, what would be the important information for the on the management? So the employees, the management, what are the things the HR department should know anyway? In other words, the feedback they have to provide, the things they have to say in the report, it's not so cost intensive. Compared with the financial reporting, the sustainability report is much smaller, much easier. We have 400 pages, but for financial reporting, there are thousands of pages with requirements. So you really have to put this into perspective. And the cost-benefit analysis that we did really showed that only a very, very small share of a company's turnover will be invested in the sustainability report. Okay, and then the question about the auditor. There will be a standard on that as well. Of course, the auditors will have to look at the CSRD. It's not just going to be like a checklist. They will have to have a look at the relevance of the various different aspects, but also the logic behind that and the materiality assessment. And if that is not correct, then there won't be an unlimited certification. Now, one question is from the audience online is, a report means I say what is the case, but for example, what's the standard for an appropriate wage for a fair pay? What's the standard for that? Well, what we have here is a tool that is supposed to promote transparency, because that's what we always hear from. We always hear from the EU. We can't tell the companies what to do. We can't tell the companies to pay a fair wage. We can only tell the companies to report how much they pay, but we can't tell them how much they are supposed to pay. We can only ask them to report on the pay. And what we did was based on the directive on the appropriate minimum wage for Europe. That was a clear basis. And we heard from the ILO, our work inspired them. So at the ILO, they also started to use our work as a basis for the definition of minimum wages in other countries as well. Okay, the technician's already giving me an angry look because time's really up. If there are further questions, we can continue our discussion during the coffee break right now. Thank you all very much. It's great you were here today. One of our colleagues couldn't come today, but I think still this has been a very interesting panel discussion. Thank you very much also to the audience and to all the observers, remote or here in this hall. So thank you very much and enjoy the other panels that you will also go to. Thank you very much.